The day I moved out for good wasn't marked by a dramatic confrontation or a tearful goodbye. It was a cold, surgical extraction. I had just turned 23, and while my parents were preoccupied with planning Chloe's extravaganza of the season, a debutante-style party for a social media brand that didn't even exist yet, I was quietly packing the few belongings I actually cared about. I didn't take the designer clothes Margaret had bought to dress me like a prop, nor did I take the jewelry Robert had gifted me to maintain appearances at the country club. I left them all in a neat pile on the bed of that drafty north wing room, a silent refund for 20 years of luck. I walked out of that mansion with my laptop, my legal documents, and a burning sense of relief that felt like oxygen hitting my lungs for the first time. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't leave a note. I simply became a ghost in the very halls where I had been treated like a shadow. I moved into a high-rise in Long Island City, a place where the sounds of the subway and the city's relentless pulse drowned out the echoing silence of the Vance estate. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a command. I was the one giving them. While I was establishing Vance & Associates Consulting, a name I chose specifically to reclaim the identity they tried to weaponize against me, the foundation of the Vance family empire was beginning to rot from the inside out. Robert Vance had always been a man of appearances, a term that in the high-stakes world of Connecticut real estate and private equity is often a polite way of saying over-leveraged. He had spent decades building a house of cards, using the equity of the family estate to fund a series of increasingly desperate offshore ventures. He was chasing the kind of infinite growth that only exists in the minds of men who believe they are too important to fail. He had a fiduciary duty to his family's future, but his only real loyalty was to the image of the billionaire patriarch. He poured millions into Chloe's influencer lifestyle, subsidizing her luxury travels and her failed business attempts, all while his own portfolios were being picked apart by a volatile market and a series of predatory lending schemes he had been arrogant enough to sign into. The man who once lectured me on fiscal responsibility while I scrubbed his floors was now bleeding cash faster than he could borrow it. The psychological shift during this period was profound. From my office in Manhattan, I watched the public filings of Robert's primary holdings begin to falter. I had access to data and market insights that he couldn't even dream of, and I could see the iceberg hitting the ship long before the band stopped playing. It was a strange, detached kind of justice. I wasn't the one sabotaging him. His own ego was doing the work for me. He had spent so long convincing himself that he was genetically superior, that his bloodline made him immune to the basic laws of economics, that he never saw the collapse coming. Chloe, meanwhile, was oblivious, posting photos of vintage champagne and private jets while the tax liens were being quietly filed against their Greenwich property. The natural heir was spending money that didn't exist, while the stray dog was quietly acquiring assets and building a liquidity pool that would soon make me the most powerful person in the family. Not that they had any idea I even existed anymore. I remember one specific evening, sitting on my balcony overlooking the East River, when I received a notification that my company had just hit a valuation of $25 million. That same night, I saw a social media post from Chloe complaining about a minor delay in her trust fund payment and blaming the incompetent bank staff. I laughed, a genuine cold laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my penthouse. The irony was almost too much to bear. They had spent 20 years making sure I wouldn't get a penny of the Vance fortune, and in doing so, they had accidentally given me the only thing that mattered, the hunger to build my own. They were so afraid I would drain their resources that they failed to notice their biological miracle was doing it for them. As the sun set over the city, I realized that the luck Robert and Margaret had boasted about was about to run out, and when the bill finally came due, I wouldn't be the one paying it. The architecture of their downfall was complete, and all I had to do was sit back and watch the house of cards fall. In the high-stakes corridors of Manhattan and the manicured lawns of Greenwich, secrets have a way of rotting until the stench becomes impossible to ignore. For the Vance family, the rot finally broke through the surface on a Tuesday morning in late October. I remember it vividly. I was sitting in my corner office on the 42nd floor, the floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of a city I had conquered on my own terms. My assistant placed a physical copy of the Wall Street Journal on my desk, and there it was, buried in the business and finance section, but screaming with implications. A report on the sudden insolvency of several major real estate holdings tied to Robert Vance. The Titan of Connecticut was being exposed as a man who had built his empire on a foundation of predatory bridge loans and cross-collateralized debt. The house of cards wasn't just shaking, it was in a freefall. Robert's desperate attempts to maintain the Vance lifestyle for Chloe had led him into a labyrinth of high-interest borrowing that even his best attorneys couldn't litigate their way out of. The man who spent 20 years treating me like a liability was finally being identified as the greatest liability his own family had ever known. The psychological fallout for Robert and Margaret was catastrophic. To people of their social standing, bankruptcy isn't just a financial status, it's a moral failing, a public stripping of their perceived genetic superiority. While I was quietly closing a $30 million acquisition deal for my software firm, the Vances were facing the brutal reality of Chapter 7 liquidation proceedings. The tax liens on the Greenwich mansion, the very house they had used as a weapon to make me feel small, were now matters of public record. Chloe, ever the oblivious narcissist, was still posting photos of designer bags and high-end galas, completely unaware that the golden child was about to become the penniless heir. I watched through the lens of my professional network as their country club memberships were revoked and their social circle, once filled with loyal flatterers, evaporated like mist. They had spent decades making sure I wouldn't have a safety net, never imagining that they were the ones walking a tightrope without a wire. The irony reached a fever pitch when a major tech publication ran a feature on the top 30 under 30 in software architecture, featuring a full-page spread on me. The headline read, Nadine Vance, the ghost in the machine building a tech empire. I hadn't used their money, their connections, or their superior lineage to get there. I had used the very work ethic they mocked, the stray dog tenacity Robert had sneered at, to build something untouchable. I heard through the grapevine that Margaret had seen the article while waiting in a lawyer's office, and for a brief moment, the facade of the lucky orphan story they had told themselves for years finally cracked. They had spent my entire childhood convincing the world they were my saviors, but as they stared down the barrel of total financial ruin, the headlines were telling a different story. The girl they threw away was the only one in the family who truly knew how to build a legacy. As the foreclosure notices were officially served, and the moving trucks began to appear at the end of their long, gated driveway, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I didn't feel the urge to call them or gloat. The cold, hard numbers on my balance sheet were a louder victory than any shouting match could ever be. I had moved from being a servant in their north wing to being a power player in the world's financial capital, while they had moved from being the masters of the universe to being cautionary tales in bankruptcy court. The luck they had weaponized against me was now a ghost story. And as I watched the sunset hit the Hudson River, I realized that the legal documents Robert had used to disinherit me were actually my liberation papers. He thought he was taking away my future, but he was actually giving me the freedom to watch theirs burn without having to smell the smoke. The first contact didn't come through an elegant invitation or a heartfelt card of apology. It arrived like a seismic wave of desperation hitting my Manhattan headquarters. When my senior executive assistant informed me that a woman named Margaret Vance was on the line, claiming a life-or-death family emergency, I felt a familiar chill, but this time it wasn't fear. It was a clinical detachment. I knew the house of cards in Greenwich had finally collapsed. Robert and Margaret had spent months trying to litigate against the inevitable, burning through the last vestiges of their credit to pay bankruptcy attorneys who were merely delaying the foreclosure of their pride. But the news of my rise in the Wall Street Journal had changed the game for them. They didn't see my success as the triumph of a daughter. They saw it as a fresh line of credit. The stray dog they had abandoned to the foster care-flavored memories of my youth was now the only person in the world with the liquidity to stop their names from being dragged through the mud of public eviction records. The audacity of that first call was almost cinematic. Margaret didn't ask for forgiveness. She demanded an audience. Her voice, once so crisp and authoritative, now trembled with a carefully choreographed fragility. She spoke about Robert's failing health, about how the stress of their financial transition was destroying him, and how they simply missed my stabilizing presence. It was a masterful performance of emotional gaslighting. They wanted me to believe that their 3-year silence had been a period of reflection, rather than an arrogant wait to see if I would fail. However, the legal jargon beneath her pleas was transparent. They were facing what we call an involuntary bankruptcy filing, and the creditors were closing in on the assets they had tried to hide in poorly managed discretionary trusts. They didn't need a daughter. They needed a white knight, a financial savior who could inject immediate capital to halt the total liquidation of the Vance estate. I agreed to the meeting, but I imposed conditions that made it clear the power hierarchy had been permanently inverted. The encounter wouldn't be at their home, nor at the country club, where they once displayed me as a trophy of their supposed charity. It would be at a glass-walled restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, a place where the architecture of steel and light reflects the brutal transparency of modern business. I wanted them to step out of their bubble of decaying privilege and into my domain. I prepared for the meeting not with nostalgia, but with a full dossier on their outstanding liabilities. As I rode to the restaurant in my private car, watching the city lights blur past, I remembered Margaret telling me I was lucky to have a roof. Now I owned the most expensive roofs in the city, and the Vances were about to find out that my charity had a very strict termination clause. When I walked into the restaurant, I saw them huddled at a corner table, trying desperately to maintain the pose of fallen aristocrats. Chloe was there too, her eyes puffy and her posture defensive, looking like a child who had just realized that Santa Claus not only wasn't real, but had also repossessed the sleigh. Robert looked like he had aged 20 years. The man who once dominated every room with his mere presence now seemed diminished, a ghost of a patriarch. We hadn't even ordered water before the facade of a family reunion evaporated. They started talking about our legacy, about how the Vance family needed to stand together against the external attacks of the creditors. Robert had the nerve to suggest that given my unexpected success, it was only a matter of fiduciary responsibility to the family name that I intervened. They didn't want love, they wanted a bailout, and they expected the grateful Orphan to still be living inside me, ready to hand over the keys to my kingdom for a pat on the head that was never coming. The tension at the table was so thick, it felt like it could be sliced with the expensive steak knives we hadn't yet used. Robert tried to maintain his patriarchal tone, speaking in circles about family unity and the moral imperative of protecting the Vance name. He was using every rhetorical trick in the book, the kind of polished, manipulative speech that had probably worked on hundreds of business associates in Connecticut. But I wasn't a business associate, and I certainly wasn't the 9-year-old girl on the rickety stool anymore. I let him finish his monologue, a desperate plea disguised as a lecture on lineage, and then I did something that turned the air in the room to ice. I reached into my briefcase, and pulled out a slim, tablet-sized dossier. I didn't say a word, as I slid it across the table, precisely mimicking the way Robert had slid the will toward me 3 years prior. It was a comprehensive breakdown of their Chapter 7 filings, their undisclosed offshore liabilities, and the specific predatory loans that were currently eating the Greenwich estate alive. I watched the blood drain from Robert's face as he realized I didn't just have money, I had the receipts. I looked at my mother, Margaret, whose hand was frozen halfway to her wine glass. I told her that I had spent the last week doing what a lucky daughter does. I did my homework. I explained to them in the cold, precise language of a forensic accountant that their current financial situation was the result of a gross breach of fiduciary duty to their own future. I pointed out that the $1.2 million Robert had invested in Chloe's failed jewelry line was actually sourced from a high-interest line of credit that used the family home as collateral. Chloe tried to interrupt, her voice shrill with a misplaced sense of entitlement, calling me spiteful and obsessed with the past. I didn't even look at her. I simply noted that according to the current bankruptcy proceedings, her trust fund didn't actually exist. It was just a series of accounting tricks that Robert had been using to keep her quiet while the ship sank. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a legacy shattering in real time. "You talk about family loyalty," I said, my voice projecting a level of calm that clearly terrified them. "But let's be honest about what this meeting is. You didn't come here to reconcile. You came here because you realized that the girl you treated like a tax deduction is now the only person with enough liquidity to stop the sheriff from putting a padlock on your front gate." I explained to Robert that as a business owner, I understood the value of a return on investment. I reminded him of his words about me being a stray dog and a survivalist. I told him that from a purely tactical standpoint, bailing them out would be the worst acquisition in history. There was no brand equity left in the Vance name, and there was certainly no goodwill left in our relationship. I watched Robert's eyes fill with a mixture of rage and genuine raw fear, the fear of a man who has finally realized that his power was an illusion he could no longer afford to maintain. The climax of the evening came when Margaret, losing her grip on her society queen persona, began to scream that I owed them for the life they gave me. She brought up the costs of my upbringing again, the food, the shelter, the opportunity they provided by choosing me. It was the same old script, but this time I had the ending. I informed her that I had calculated every cent they had ever spent on me, adjusted for inflation, and compared it to the thousands of hours of unpaid labor I performed as a charity case in their home. I told her that legally and morally the debt was settled long ago. In fact, if we were to look at it as a contract, they were actually in the red. I stood up, leaning over the table just enough to make them recoil, and delivered the final blow. I told them that I wasn't just refusing to help them, I was going to watch the foreclosure auction. Not out of malice, but because I wanted to see the exact moment they realized that luck is something you build, not something you inherit. The walk from the restaurant to my car was the quietest moment of my entire life. Behind me, inside those glass walls, the Vance legacy was effectively decomposing in a pool of expensive Cabernet and shattered pride. I didn't look back to see Robert's face or to hear Margaret's final desperate insults. I didn't need to. In the world of high-stakes litigation and estate law, there is a term called quiet enjoyment, which usually refers to a tenant's right to occupy a property without interference. But as I watched the neon lights of Manhattan blur past my window, I realized I had finally achieved a personal version of quiet enjoyment. For 25 years, my mind had been a noisy courtroom where I was constantly on trial, defending my right to exist, my right to eat, and my right to be called a daughter. But tonight, the judge had walked out, the jury had been dismissed, and the courtroom was finally blissfully silent. I wasn't the lucky orphan anymore, and I wasn't the ungrateful daughter. I was simply Nadine, a woman who had paid her debts in full and walked away with the title deed to her own soul. A few weeks later, the news hit the local Connecticut papers. The Vance estate was heading to a public foreclosure auction. It was a cold sale, meaning the property was being sold as is to satisfy a mountain of secured debt. I considered buying it through one of my shell companies, just to turn it into a shelter for foster kids who actually needed a home, but I decided against it. To buy that house would be to keep a piece of their poison in my portfolio. I wanted nothing that smelled like their charity. I heard through professional channels that Robert and Margaret had moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental in a much less prestigious town, and that Chloe had taken a job in retail, a concept so foreign to her that I'm sure it felt like a prison sentence. They reached out one last time, a pathetic email from Robert's new non-professional account, asking for a family loan to help with Margaret's supposed medical bills. I didn't block them this time. I simply didn't respond. In the language of the law, a non-response is sometimes the loudest verdict you can deliver. Sometimes late at night, in the stillness of my penthouse, the trauma tries to creep back in. It's an annoying, persistent thing, a ghost that doesn't care about logic or bank balances. I'll find myself standing in my designer kitchen, looking at my hands, and for a split second, I'm back on that rickety wooden stool in Greenwich, waiting for a reprimand that isn't coming. But then I do something small and normal. I fold a towel, I lock my door. I look out at the skyline I helped build, and I notice that my shoulders aren't hunched up by my ears anymore. I'm not rehearsing apologies in my head. I'm not auditioning for a love that has to be earned through labor. The silence in my home isn't threatening. It's a sanctuary. I've realized that being lucky wasn't about being taken in by the Vances. The real luck was the strength I found to survive them. This is the end of the story that Robert and Margaret tried to write for me. They wanted a tragedy about a girl who owed them everything. Instead, I gave them a documentary about a woman who owed them nothing. To anyone listening out there who has been told they should be grateful for a love that feels like a cage, you are allowed to break the lock. You are allowed to be the architect of your own rescue. Family isn't about the blood in your veins or the name on a legal document. It's about the people who don't make you feel like a debt that needs to be settled. As for me, I'm done looking for a seat at their table. I've built my own, and the view from here is spectacular. My name is Nadine Vance, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I belong.